Okay, we're starting. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Eve Stern from the Humanities Center, and I'm so delighted to kick off our annual Brown Bag Lunchtime series with a talk by Professor James Haile from Philosophy and English. And I'm going to invite my colleague, Professor Kendall Moore from Journalism and Film Studies, to come up and introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Eve. So greetings and welcome everybody to the Center for Humanities Brown Bag event featuring Dr. James Haile III. Before we get into Dr. Haile's presentation on why Black philosophy needs Afrosurrealism and Black speculative fiction, I'd like to share a brief words of introduction. Dr. James B. Haile III is an associate professor of philosophy and English and is also an Afro-surrealist and Afro-futurist writer. He is the author of The Buck, the Black, and the Existential Hero, refiguring the Black male literary canon from 1850 to present. That's a short title from 2020. In The Buck, Haile combines literary theory and Black existential philosophy in an analysis of Ralph Ellison, Frederick Douglass, Percival Everett, and Cecil Brown. He beautifully investigates the role of theatricality in Black male life and within Black male literature to demonstrate the ways that Black male life is itself akin to an up-close magical act meant for both deception and self-protection. And his soon-to-be released book, The Dark Delight of Being Strange, Black Stories of Freedom, published by Columbia University Press, I think it comes out in December, is a series of stories and essays. The book examines how Black speculative fiction, quote, responds to enslavement, racism, colonialism, and capitalism, and how it reveals a life beyond social and political alienation. So if you're unfamiliar with Black speculative fiction, I'm sure Dr. Haile will explain it, but I will give a very brief definition. So it's very well described by Joseph Earl Thomas of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, who explains how the genre, question mark, is it a genre, leans into the what if aspect of speculation as a point of departure for articulating the lived experiences of diasporic Black subjects. Black speculative fiction is mostly interested in a critique of reality that centers the specific alienation of Black people in the past, present, and sometimes the future, spanning across genres. There's that word again, question mark. Is it a genre? Is it an ontology? Is it an epistemology? I hope we have that question at the end. So spanning across genres, it assumes the inadequacy of reality or realism as the sole category for remembering, thinking, or learning. He combines this with Afro-surrealism, which Lenari Bakari of The Guardian describes as strangeness, I love this definition, strangeness and Blackness not only coexisting, but being impossible to separate. If you've heard of Phyllis Wheatley or Octavia Butler, many have read both of them, you've experienced Black speculative fiction. And if you have seen the film Get Out, for example, by Jordan Peele, or watched the series in Atlanta, which I loved, then you will have experienced Afro-surrealism. In The Dark Delight, Haile explores the relationship between philosophy and Black literature, interrogating the imagination and memory in terms of how we think about and engage with time and space. In particular, it is interested in how we construct the past, arguing that our rendering of the past and the archive of the past is the product of the speculative imagination. I agree. Dark Delight is an attempt to retell the past and reimagine the archive through an engagement with Black speculative fiction and imagination. In the book, he re-envisions, I'm excited to read this, re-envisions Black technologies of freedom through Henry Box Brown's famed escape from slavery in a wooden crate. He fashions an anti-colonial hollow earth theory from the works of H.G. Wells and Jules Verne, and considers the octopus and its ability to camouflage itself as a model for Black survival strategies, among others. He rethinks historical and contemporary Black experiences, as well as figures as Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois, Henry Dumas, and Toni Morrison. Dr. Haile is a well-respected scholar known for his works on Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, Jean-Paul Sartre, and James Baldwin, and he is helping to advance the field of Black philosophy, which I am grateful for because it is also something that I studied. Dr. Haile received his BA from Morehouse. He's a Morehouse man. In 2002, he has a master's degree from the University of Memphis and a PhD from Duquesne University. At URI, he teaches courses in existentialism, Africana philosophy, Black literary theory, and African American fiction. His next book, next book, This Too Shall Pass, will be literary fiction. It will combine Afrosurrealism and Afrofuturist tropes and modes of literary construction. He is an absolute brilliant mind, and I'm so very grateful for his intellectual companionship here at URI. So please join me in welcoming Dr. James Haile III.
Thank you, Kendall. That was much more than I anticipated, but I appreciate it. And I'm going to definitely have to steal that definition of Afro-surrealism. And I'll have to give you the quote of the quote. All right, so what I'm going to talk about today is a portion of one of the chapters in the stories in the book itself. I'm going to be piecing together Afro-surrealism and Black speculative fiction with Black philosophy to demonstrate, hopefully, the impact, influence, and critical importance of these elements when they're joined in concert. Part of what I'm hoping to achieve in this, hold on 1 second. Okay. Part of what I'm hoping to achieve in this is answering two sort of critical questions. How Black politics is linked to Afro-surrealism, because usually we think about politics as something empirical, something material. Afro-surrealism is something that is more speculative and even something that's something nice to have, but on the side. But I want to show how it's actually material. Two, why is Black freedom, subjectivity, and liberty best understood through Black speculative fiction? So not just how Afro-surrealism is linked to Black politics, but how these things themselves are best understood through this lens. So before I get started, I just want to set my clock so I won't go over because I know myself and I will go over. Okay. All right. So I want to say something really quickly about where this project comes from, sort of the motivation of it. And the motivation of it is largely in our political imagination, especially as we go into things like voting, things like whether or not the state itself, the nation state itself, is the best way to secure freedom. All these kind of questions we'll talk about later on. But I want to talk about as sort of the foundation part of how we construct our political imagination, what we imagine to be a subject, what we imagine to be freedom, and where that imagination comes from. The second one is our historical imagination and how we understand the past. And we largely understand the past by imposing the present onto it. And so we often miss what the past is actually giving us so we can push forward. And I want us to think about these two things as sort of like the seminal motivation for the project overall, but also for this particular talk. In this talk, I will be addressing these questions through an analysis of Du Bois's The Comet. It's a science fiction piece. Frederick Douglass's historical fiction, Heroic Slave, I want to say is the first Black speculative fiction written in this country. James Baldwin's letter to my nephew, Saidiya Hartman's meditation on Du Bois's story. And finally, on Boots Riley's film, Sorry to Bother You, and Lena Waithe's Queen and Slim, as cinematic encapsulations of these general arguments. Ultimately, I'm hoping to convince philosophers, especially those working in Black intellectual and social political traditions, of the critical importance of the speculative fiction and Afro-surrealist traditions for thinking and engaging these living concepts by demonstrating the ways that Black thinkers and writers have always engaged in this work. So part of the sort of background of this, I'll say really quickly, is I want to argue that all Black writers from the very beginning of the written word, letters in the American context, have always been Afro-surrealist and speculative writers. And that's a big claim to make, and historians have told me that. You can't make that claim. but we'll see. But let's first begin with the story. I remember going to the theater to see Boots Riley's film Sorry to Bother You like it was yesterday. The theater was unexpectedly packed, and like most folks in the room, I did not quite know what to expect from the film, given its cryptic trailer. A series of seemingly random clips interspersed with shots of our leader, with our lead, that's Lakeith Stanfield on the left, sometimes with his hair in a mixture of afro and locks, and sometimes his head wrapped in gauze, lying in bed with his girlfriend, telling her, yeah, I'm just out here surviving. And what am I gonna, what I'm doing right now won't even matter. From the trailer, it seemed like it could be one of those Sundance films about poverty and race, the likes of which The Last Black Man in San Francisco victoriously covered. But there was more. At times, it seemed much more surreal accounting of Black life. And this is, we're gonna run a really quick clip, and I'll tell you about it and then we'll watch it. Let me give you a tip, says one of the actors, Danny Glover. You wanna make some money here? A question that is very matter-of-factly answered, use your white voice. From the trailer, here seems to not simply be a location or the place of business, but like anywhere USA, is a much deeper metaphysical sense. Metaphysical code switching. And then he's told, not like, now I'm not talking about the Will Smith white our lead character Cassius is told, but like this young blood. And then he does the voice, hey, Mr. Kramer, it's Langston from Regalview. A voice taken to a different octave, housing not just an actual tone, but an actual world, possessing a different culture. More than simply being nasal, it's a shift of the undertones in something that is unnameably subtle. And we don't have time to watch the whole clip, but we'll watch a few seconds of it. Yeah, film it. All right, so our leading man is successful, moving up in the ranks, literally moving upstairs to be a power caller, having mastered the whiteness of this unnameable subtlety. We knew coming into the film that we would be watching what was sold to us as a, quote, jolt from the blue, a must-see, wildly inventive, something you need to believe, brilliantly outrageous, wildly original, all those things are flashing as you're watching the trailer. One of the best comedies of the year. And the word comedy is going to be interesting here because we're going to analyze that later. What I could not have known, and what we could not have all known going in, is the extent to which this unnameable subtlety and its undertones will be fleshed out to their absurd end in a literal transformation of a man or the approximation of one into an animal. Specifically a horse hybrid, but not really a commodity or a product reflecting both the Marxian hyperbole of the dumb commodity and what Fred Moten claims the nightmares aftermath of slavery, which paradoxically produces a dumb commodity that can somehow magically speak. So we're going to get to exactly what this transformation is and why it's a mixture of the sort of Marxian hyperbole, but also Fred Moten's notion of Black Death. But in more than what could just be an academic exchange of words, in hindsight, and even perhaps at the time, I asked myself why this unnameable subtlety, why this hyperbolic and paradoxical nightmare could or should be the setting for a comedy. So why do we understand this particular film as a comedy? Why do we have to watch this, whatever it was? And if you watch the movie, you'll probably try to figure out whatever this thing was we were watching to learn something. But what were we supposed to learn? About what? And why did the entire audience, black and white, laugh uproariously? Why was the surreal depiction of black life in contemporary America humorous? What makes Boots Riley film a jolt from the blue, a must-see, wildly inventive, something that you need to see to believe, brilliantly outrageous and wildly original, if it is all of these at all, is the fact that it forces us to see the world as it is, as absurd as it is in and of itself. The main character is aptly named Cassius Green, so Cash is green, both to signify his desire for money and his monetary or use value to the company. So he is a commodity, but he's also trying to commodify himself in order to attain a commodity. So it's just like multiple layer. And in a seminal moment towards the end of the movie, he is given advice akin to the advice the Invisible Man is given at an equally absurd and surreal moment in the novel Invisible Man. At the end of the film, Cassius is advised by this man who has an eye patch for no reason. Apparently, he just has an eye patch and a bowler. He's advised by this man, look here, young blood. We don't cry about the shit that should be. We just thrive on what is. And what is opportunity. I remember this scene precisely. I remember I stopped laughing for a moment to initially query why Cassius' advisor is wearing an eye patch, and eventually came to this question: is he given an opportunity? Just like Cassius, I had to ask myself the same question. Was I being given an opportunity? Here I was with a PhD in philosophy, the queen of the sciences. These are things philosophers themselves say. Queen of the sciences, highest degree of the land, so higher than all the other PhDs, because it's named after philosophy. In a field notoriously thin on Black people, there are about 117 out of about 10,000. Particularly Black men, which make up about 50 of them, 60 of them. Perhaps this is why I stopped laughing, almost choking on my popcorn, looking around to see faces, Black and white, still laughing. And I thought about Gerard Carmichael in Moonlight. Jay-Z's video spoof of Friends, when at the end, Carmichael stops while shooting a scene, the scripted humor fading in the background as a sound of the laughing, to walk around and take note that he is indeed watching himself being filmed and noticing that there are those who are laughing, entertained by his performance. And he asks himself about the nature of this performance. After having stepped outside of the set and into the night to see the moon as Jay-Z's voice replaces the dialogue and the crowd noise. And we're stuck in La La Land. Even when we win, we're gonna lose. And if you haven't seen this, it's a spoof of a spoof. So Friends has notoriously been noted as stealing from Living Single. So a sitcom was first, and then the white sitcom took the characters, whitened them, put them in a white context, even somehow New York is still white. And Jay-Z does a spoof of the spoof. And so he blackens the characters to go back to Living Single, but also he doesn't actually change the scene. So all the words are the same. So if you know Friends, you'll know that what the scene is. It's one of the seminal scenes. And we won't watch the whole thing, just give you a sense of it. Put closed captioning on. You tell me. Oh. it is more of this, so we'll skip ahead of it a little bit to where he's actually doing a meta. The notion of the Black subversive being the something that is without teeth, something that he's thinking about, and which causes him to do sort of this meta-analysis of himself. All right, so there's a lot that we can unpack during Q&A. I don't have time to unpack it all, but there's multiple levels and layers that go into this talk. Unlike Queen and Slim, the surrealist drama where you know how the movie would end. So if you ever gone to and seen the film, I knew how the film was going to end. I think everyone in the theater knew how the film was going to end, how it had to end, and yet you hoped that it would end differently than you experienced or expected it to. The ending of Sorry to Bother You was indeed surreal and strange, but perhaps it was equally as predictable if you were to face, that means really to face, the fact of Black death or Black living death, but you have yet to face with satirical clarity the need to read Sorry to Bother You. So I'm going to make the argument that Sorry to Bother You and Queen and Slim were in fact the same film. Queen and Slim, though, is a bit more beguiling than just Black death or Black living death. Though the film is framed within these, it is really about transformation, but not Boots Riley's sort of transformation, where men are transformed into monstrous form of capital accumulation, the body itself becoming the nexus point of a kind of grotesque capital consumption. I want to make the argument that Queen and Slim, there's a transformation. Sorry to Bother You is a transformation. Queen and Slim tries to get out of the capital system, and then there's a transformation that happens there. But when you see Sorry to Bother You, he's trying to commodify himself, which creates a different kind of monstrous transformation. But both have transformation as their core. In this transformation, they and the viewing audience in Queen and Slim come to understand, expect, and accept a certain reality in which the horror itself becomes normative. And as much As this understanding, expectation, and acceptance are transformative, they are in their normativity invisibly deforming. And this invisible deformation itself becomes a foundation for both Queen and Slim and the viewing audience. Boots Riley, though, takes this normativity of Black life and makes it abnormally jarring through hyperbole, which, while exaggerated, still somehow feels connected to the world that we inhabit. What Riley's film demonstrates is that what we often do not see is the subtle but monstrous transformations we undergo. The ones underlying our expectations and our acceptance of the violent deaths of both Queen and Slim, and our irrational hope against this realization for their escape, for their safety, and for their basic right to self and life defense and affirmation. To become what is necessary for the marketplace, to participate in it, and in some way to thrive according to its edicts. So part of what Queen and Slim is telling us is some of the maladies of what happens when Black people actually take up subjectivity and citizenship as their own. So part of the self-protection, self-affirmation, dignity, and it ends in death. And with Sorry to Bother You, he tries to take up all of these things by accruing capital. And that has a different kind of deformation because he has the hope that capital is going to be enough to actually secure him. It's one of the reasons I wanted to show you 444 because of what he also says about O.J. Simpson later on. In Sorry to Bother You, this monstrosity was ever presently clear in the form of the equisapien. Turning men into horses for profit sounds absurd and surreal. But what is Queen and Slim but a byproduct of a metaphysics in which labor is conscripted in such a way as to be extracted through not only the wage, but the very nature of work itself. So we think about the idea of capital accumulation and the idea of the enslaved as a body without labor, as labor that can be stripped away from the body. And then we think about what he's doing in Sorry to Bother You by transforming the body into just physical labor. But labor can be stripped away as a resource for a company. It's certainly a parallel. The endings of Sorry to Bother You and Queen and Slim are both surreal and both absurd. In the first, a Black man who hopes to transform himself from an impoverished man who lives in his uncle's garage mistakenly believes that a white man, CEO of a company, who promises him $100 million, a promise made on the back of a napkin. That's part of the humor of it. And in what appears to be a crayon or a Sharpie, and instead finds himself turned into a half-horse monstrosity. In the second, a Black man on a first date with a Black woman he has just met shoots and kills a police officer while defending himself and her. And after having successfully evaded capture for 2 hours, what seems to be the lifetime of the film itself, they find themselves on a tarmac about to board a plane to Cuba when they are intercepted by the police and killed. In both ways, these endings echo of what James Baldwin discusses in his advice to his nephew in the famous open letter. Namely, this innocent country set you down in a ghetto in which, in fact, it intended that you should perish. Let me spell out precisely what I mean by that, for that is the heart of the matter here and the crux of my dispute with my country. You were born where you were born and faced the future that you faced because you were Black and for no other reason. And we're going to circle the term Black and then interrogate exactly what Black he's talking about. Because he's not talking about Black as in the human being, but Black as a social, political condition. I know your countrymen do not agree with me here, and I hear them saying you exaggerate. They do not know Harlem, and I do. So do you. Take no one's word for anything, including mine, but trust your own experience. Baldwin here is identifying for his nephew the surreality of Black American identity, which Baldwin seems to be suggesting is so absurd and so dangerous because of this duality of chains. The duality produced, remember, by the inherent conflict of Black life within an industrial, post-industrial, and pre- and post-mechanized world constituted by labor and the diminution of humanity. A duality represented for Baldwin as a conflict between what will be termed the inheritance and the legacy. So part of what Baldwin is trying to get his nephew to understand is the condition that he's in is something preset by the entire economy itself. And the entire economy itself needs a certain kind of labor, but also can't let that labor live a human life. And so those two conflicts are going to be sort of the formation of what I think Baldwin is getting at here between inheritance and legacy. The tension here is between the very fact and act and notion of citizenship in humanity and the relationship to Blackness. That is to say, Baldwin is suggesting that although Black Americans are Americans and thus citizens, their living reality does not reflect this fact. As we will see a bit later, this tension between inheritance and legacy is really a tension between natural history and human social reality. So what we consider to be the natural state of the world and how we organize our society around it. Baldwin in his letter is pulling at these edges, unraveling them to show, even implicitly, that there is this tension, one that cannot be fully reconciled in the way that Afro-pessimists, including Frank Wilderson, seem to be able to reconcile it. So Baldwin can't reconcile the reality of being a citizen and the reality of being denied citizenship in terms of being able to enact it. You can also think about it as having freedom, but not having the liberty to express your freedom. For Wilderson, the reason for this tension is fairly straightforward. Black people cannot be citizens because a category of the citizen is itself anti-Black. And we'll talk about maybe the nation state being that as well. That is, the very notion of the citizen emerges from the natural history of the subject, a natural history that has precluded Blackness from subjecthood. What is more, for Wilderson and for others, Blackness is not just antithetical to citizenship and subjecthood. Blackness is that which against the citizen and the subject measures itself as markers for their achievement. Here's what Wilderson writes at the beginning of his autobiography, Afro-Pessimism. I started writing an academic monograph that explained how and why the human, and it's capitalized because it's not a biological human, but the social human in which biology is understood through the social lens. The human capacity, the power of the subject and of relations is violently parasitic on Black flesh. That showed how the human is not an organic entity, but a construct that requires its other in order to be legible, and why the human other is Black. And there are lots of people who are in the academic world who don't like the Afro-pessimists for this reason, for this particular phrasing of it. If we place Wilderson's word next to Baldwin's words, what appears is an answer to a conundrum Baldwin introduces. You are born where you were born and face the future that you face because you are Black and for no other reason. And then I think the elliptical part would be because the human other is Black. For Wilderson, this breach is insoluble. When placed in conversation, one begins to see the conflict between the human and Blackness is also apparent in Baldwin's letter, which makes the ending of Sorry to Bother You especially poignant. The difference may be that Baldwin does not directly argue as Wilderson does, principally because he's writing to his nephew. His nephew's 14 years old. But it can be surmised in a letter, equally biographical as though written to himself as he reflects over his own life. This functions as a kind of internal debate. In a 1963 interview, Baldwin says, I can't be a pessimist because I'm alive. To be a pessimist means you've agreed that human life is an academic matter. So I'm forced to be an optimist. I'm forced to believe that we can survive whatever we need to survive. The key word here is survive. In his 1963 interview, Baldwin returns to this word that he introduced in his letter. Blackness principally is linked to death and its navigation, as described by Baldwin himself and as he suggests to his nephew, and is a thoroughgoing surviving of it. So Blackness is not just the social condition of Blackness, but is also having to survive that social condition. In other words, to be Black is to learn how to survive Blackness. But what could Baldwin mean here? Given perhaps a dual audience, himself and his nephew, one could further surmise, following a philosophical idea of survival, that Baldwin knows and is acknowledging in a less explicit way than Wilderson that Blackness and humanity in the West are not only ontologically distinct, but are also metaphysically at odds, necessitating the idea of an ontological need of Blackness to survive the metaphysical state of Blackness. That is to say, the very notion of the human carries within it a fundamental disjuncture, one that produces a literal monstrosity in Cassius' attempt to circumvent the system of blackness and death, not simply by surviving blackness, but also trying to turn it into a victory. So trying to take his blackness and monetize it and then control that monetization of it. And in a similar kind of monstrosity, Queen and Slim attempt to defend themselves against this blackness, so against the specter of their threatening existence, to do more than just survive their encounter with the police, but also to retain a sense of dignity. An act and a belief both to defend themselves and survive the encounter that we know must end with death. It was this disjuncture, I think, that caused me to pause and almost choke with laughter with the advice that Cassius is given. Look here, young blood, we don't cry about the shit that should be. We just thrive on what is, and what is opportunity. And to wonder of the nature of opportunity that Baldwin and Wilderson are discussing. Here, then, the question emerges for me. Well, how then are we to understand this reality? How are we to frame it? Is it enough to talk about freedom and liberty in a Euro-modern tradition and merely extend this idea to Black people? Is it enough to assume that the logics of Euro-modernity are enough to capture what Baldwin, Wilderson, Riley, and Waithe are telling us? Could one be both Black and human? Does one want to be both Black and human? Should one? Or would that desire itself be a belief of merely surviving Blackness? So where does this leave us? Baldwin leaves us with a seemingly unanswerable paradox, one that Wilderson is clearly ready to articulate. Our inheritance is not the freedom of a uniquely American ethos, but of a social and physical death. But our legacy, then, is not that of liberty, of this distinctly American reality, but that of love. Not the love of romance or Hollywood happy endings, but a kind of determination not to be resolute or to not merely hope to survive this world, but in some way to actually survive it, transforming it, as it were, from a condition of death into that of life. So I want to make the argument, this is where the surrealism comes in, that what they're actually asking for is an alternative Black space, one that's outside of the Euro-modern reality. This is what Baldwin is telling his nephew, but he won't say it directly. Our inheritance might be this death, but our legacy is found in our determination to love one another in the face of this death. But instead of just telling his nephew this, he tells his nephew, you were born where you were born, and you face the future that you face because you're Black and for no other reason. But he also tells him, here you were to be loved, baby, hard, that at once and forever to strengthen you against this loveless world. Conjoining these two sentiments clearly lays out Baldwin's lesson. If we are not constituted in white freedom, that is a desire for whiteness as freedom in Black skin, or Blackness as a kind of monstrosity, then we must be constituted somewhere else, and that somewhere else is love. Not the sort that distorts into faith and to hope, but one that steals and provides another mode of engagement with the world altogether. Baldwin here could be misread as equating love, survival, and death. It appears he is talking about survival and love as if they are synonymous, as if reassuring his nephew about love mitigates his life as death and allows him to survive it. For Wilderson, this is what makes Blackness so daunting. This is why he says people avoid the sort of Afro-pessimist view. Love and survival are not synonymous. They are coterminous. That is, the inheritance is coterminous with the legacy. Blackness is both love and death. It is love in death. And people who are Black existentialists say this is why it's the most human reality, because you actually have to face your finitude and at the same time simultaneously live a human life within the shadow of that finitude. This is why Baldwin uses the term survive and the term love, but what he really means is to endure. We must endure Blackness, for surviving it would be akin to accepting it, and rejecting it for the sake of hope would be akin to making oneself a monster. So somehow survive it without hope. It's very, it's a very existentialist sort of frame, to live without hope. In other words, unlike whiteness, in which the legacy is but an outgrowth of the inheritance, one has a capacity and expectation for liberty because one is free. So we can think about Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death, in which liberty is akin to life, the lack of it is akin to death. One has, Blackness finds its inheritance in conflict with this legacy. One must love because one's existence is in the face of this kind of expiation. This is what makes Blackness beguiling, but it also gives it its creative possibility. This is at the heart of Queen and Slim, and this is what makes the film so compelling. It could perhaps be argued that this is the central element and theme of the film. Its fundamental and galvanizing element. Listen to what Slim tells Queen when they are both on the run, while they know they're going to be caught, while they know they're going to be killed. I want someone to always love, who's always going to love me no matter what. Someone that's going to hold my hand and never let go. She going to be my legacy. Look, I ain't going to bend the world. Notice how Slim answers the question, what do you want? And has that question returned to him. He simply says that he wants someone who's going to hold on and never let go. One may get the image of the two of them at the end of the film, holding hands facing the firing squad. But this is not the image that I think that the directors had in mind. The image that is tied to this moment and to the sentiment of holding on and not letting go, instead, is an image of Queen and Slim. This is the still, but we're going to watch the video. It's an image of Queen and Slim at a club, dancing, holding on to each other's bodies, while surrounded by other Black people who recognize who they are as those Black people who are on the run, and with a slight nod, recognize themselves and each other as mutually holding on and not letting go. The dance floor and the club becomes itself a kind of metaphysical Black body, not one that holds back the world in a negative sacred space, or one that allows the disillusion of their own impending death, nor is it a space that transcends this world by simply the act of loving and offering hope. I want to say it's a parallel of the dimensional space. No, it's not that space. It's a metaphysical Black body that is one of endurance, one in which holding on and never letting go is a legacy, and with it, its coterminous inheritance. So this is one scene where they are on the run, and in this particular scene, he asks her to go dancing, and they know the police are looking for them, the National Guard is looking for them, and she says, "You're willing to be caught just to go dancing?" And his answer is hell yes. And so they go to a club to go dancing, even though they're facing death. Let me get this to work. Okay. Sure, what happened? Okay. It jumps ahead. Okay. So during Q&A, we can talk about the scene breakdown. So when Lena Waithe talks about how she actually shapes this scene in terms of lighting, in terms of placement of bodies, in terms of the angles that she cuts. She's trying to create another worldly reality in which the outside world we know is there, but is also held at bay in this sort of parallel reality. And there's something significant here that we're going to talk about later on in the last part with Frederick Douglass. The function then of the Afro-Surreal is to access this Black metaphysical space outside of the Euro-modern tradition. And the function of the Black speculative fiction then is to offer us a language to describe and understand the nature of this space. So the Afro-Surreal actually gets us into this other parallel reality. And then the Black speculative fiction gives us a language to describe what's going on in this reality. One could say this whole idea of Black speculative fiction begins with Frederick Douglass and his attempt to make sense of his own origin as an enslaved person, and by extension, the origin or the narrative rendering of enslaved persons generally. One could say this genre formally began with Douglass's engagement with the irony of the slave narrative itself, its structure, and its content, as a formal accounting written by one who did not formally exist. A fundamental argument disguised as an informal memoir that gave the enslaved not only a beginning and thus a narrative, but also an existential historical self, and is also a philosophical argument attesting to their humanity as a rational subject, challenging the social, political, and legal locatedness of the enslaved as either subhuman or non-human other. And so you can look at Heroic Slave in this way, and Douglass begins by discussing that even though there's this figure who's enslaved and he has no origin, he's going to create an origin story for him. But one could also say this whole project begins with love, which underscores slave narratives themselves. That is to say, the element inherent in all slave narratives is a self-grounding in which is not material or political freedom, but one that is founded in the kind of love that motivates, animates one's own sense of purpose and identity. This, it seems, is the undermined element of Douglass's story itself. And the lead character, Madison Washington, in Douglass's historical fiction, Heroic Slave. Douglass tells a story not only of transformation of a man from enslaved to liberated, of the ontological and metaphysical change in this process, but also the usual and unusual circumstance of the transformation in two mystical and intertwined forces: the love of a man for his wife and the transformation of a place into a mystical reality called the Great Dismal Swamp. Before I go on, I had this conversation because this portion largely came out of a conversation I had with Marcus Nevius when he was here in his work in the Great Dismal Swamps, because he has a section where he talks about Frederick Douglass and the Great Dismal Swamps. And I was asking him about the mysticism that goes in, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And he said, well, as an historian, I can only go on what I can prove, but quietly is kept. Yeah, I think you're right. So, like there's some elements here that I think that are going on that are important because Black speculative fiction and Afro-surrealism can prove things in a way historians might not be able to. So it gives us a different lens for doing research than ordinarily might be understood. The Heroic Slave begins with Madison Washington having escaped from enslavement, living in the swamp adjacent to his former plantation, where his wife is still enslaved. Douglass is careful in his description of Madison Washington's home. It's not the plantation, but next to it. Not just the forest, but a mystical place of transformation called the Great Dismal Swamp. In doing so, Douglass is also careful to mirror Washington's own condition with that of the swamp. While a fugitive from the law, Washington has made his home in the forest near the plantation where his wife still resides. Unable to leave her behind, he sneaks into the plantation grounds at night and during the day steals away to the forest. The forest operates outside of the plantation as a secret and unknown place that defies the laws and logic of enslavement, just as Washington's own love for his wife and marriage defy the laws and logic of enslaved self-possession. Douglass, in this way, tells a story of a man who, while living in the forest, is transformed by two different kinds of privation. So on the one hand, his own condition while he's in the swamp. He does not overturn enslavement, but he only holds it at bay. Secondarily, his absence from enslavement also means his absence from his wife. For while remaining estranged from enslavement in the woods, he also remains estranged from his wife, who is still enslaved. Washington's condition then is functionally liminal. Between two worlds that collide, the evasion or suspension of one, enslavement, threatening the integrity or reality of the other, which is his love. And yet Douglass resolves this transformation of the forest and the swamp itself into a kind of Lagrange point, a hidden location between worlds where Washington and his wife could dwell together. In this way, Douglass depicts how Washington is transformed by his wife and about terraforming the world itself. He writes, "As I lay there among the leaves, I was strongly tempted to return to the house of my master to give up myself. But remember the solemn pledge I made the Sunday morning. I was to linger there 2 hours between 10 and midnight. I call them the long hours." And I don't want to, I'll sort of speed ahead because I'm just watching the time. Part of what makes this particular story important is because Douglass is also telling a larger historical point, because many of the Black revolutionaries, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Nat Turner, went into the swamps as one kind of person and came out the swamps as a great revolutionary, to the point where some of the white landowners around were wondering, should we drain the swamps, because whatever's going on has to be stopped. And part of what I want to argue is that there is a alternate reality, dimensional spaces going on in these swamps, in which the enslaved have a sense of their own self-possession while they're in the swamp. And the only way to have the self-possession is to have this distance from the enslaver world. So to wrap up, I'll skip ahead. Du Bois has a piece called The Comet, which is a fictional piece. And in the fictional piece, Du Bois writes about a Black man who goes underneath the ground. A comet flies over the earth, sprays gas, kills everyone Black and white on the surface. He comes back to the surface thinking he's the only person that exists and that is alive. And this is the only time where this person can go wherever he wants. So this character now can go and eat at any diner. He can go sit at any part of the car. And Saidiya Hartman says, well, if this is the case, then the only way he can be free is that the world has to come to an end. And part of what I think Afro-surrealists and Black speculative fiction gives us is a post-apocalyptic view of how the world ends and what world begins next. Thank you.
Then for people who aren't rushing off to a class, and James, if for the benefit of the online audience, if you could repeat the question from the audience, so I can hear you on the Zoom. Thank you.
Questions. A lot more to discuss. We can talk about post-apocalyptic freedom. Yes.
Thank you. So how do you, if you do, relate what he says at the in the letter? He says, of course, what I'm asking you is the impossible.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the least that we can do.
Mm-hmm.
And then he uses this wonderful expression. What history proves, especially African-American history,
Mm-hmm.
is the perpetual achievement of the impossible.
Mm-hmm.
Does that relate in any critical way or central way to your project here?
Yes. So the question, I'm going to see if I can reframe, say it really quickly, is about the role of the impossible, or the idea of the impossible, and the idea that African-American history has shown the perpetual belief in the impossible and the perpetual sort of doing of the impossible.
The achievement.
Yeah, the achievement of the impossible. So yes, so part of what I want to argue is that within a modern, Euro-modern context of in which we think about subjectivity, freedom, and that linear progression of the individual towards this thing called freedom. Within that space, that Black freedom is not possible. And that it's only possible when we can actually subtend, suspend, or create a different alternate reality in which that freedom can be then enacted. And when that freedom then comes back into the Euro-modern world, it looks like it's this impossible feat. It looks like it's this thing that should not exist, yet simultaneously does. And there's really no explanation for how it exists. And I think because if you're on that timeline, that it is a metaphysical impossibility, so it's either miraculous or it's somehow demonic. And so a lot of times Black life and things that Black people were doing were seen as demonic because it subtended the very nature of life itself, or the very nature of what could be possible in and of itself. And I have some things I can say about that with a couple of JC songs, but I'll hold off on that.
So you're with us, we're all here together in the university, in academia. You mentioned before how you you were inspired by the film to question or to reconceive of your own being. Is there post-apocalyptic freedom in academia?
So I can give you the no, I'm joking. I was gonna say I'll give you the answer before drinks. Yes, I think partly that most people who are in whatever professional or institutional framework that they're in don't think that there's life outside of that framework. And once you get into that mode of reality, then no, there's no freedom. Because if you think that there's an exchange that can be made between selling your labor and selling yourself for this notion of freedom at the other end, then you probably will never be free because you think that there's an exchange to be made. It's partly why Bruce Riley he says he's a Marxist. I don't know if he's, but he says he's a Marxist, not just a socialist, in the sense that he doesn't think there's any possibility of human freedom within a capitalist system. And so in that framework, probably not. Unless we can radically rethink about what we are within this kind of space. And I have more to say about that too. Yeah, there's a lot more to say about that.
So the examples that you use here and in this framework are all pretty centralized around the Black American experience, and outside of that context it becomes colorism or some other concept. Have you seen or do you plan to work with kind of applying these concepts to global ideas of freedom, or is it more still focused on the Black American experience?
So the question was, I'm sorry, I did not restate the last question, but the question is that the context for the presentation was largely U.S. American context, and whether or not this can be applied, or am I planning to apply it to a global context? Yes, it can be, I think, applied. I think that there's something that is universal about the kind of surreal moment that we're in that can be applied. And I sort of hinted towards it when I suggested that maybe the nation state itself or citizenship itself might be one of the causes of this kind of exploitation, because of the things that we're forced to do in order to sustain ourselves as citizens against those that are not legal persons, and the idea that there are institutions that have the right to recognize you as a human and have the right to recognize and refuse dignity and rights. I think that sort of framework is something that's explored in speculative fiction, and something that people like Du Bois sort of explore when he starts to move towards Pan-Africanism and exploring different formations of human political reality outside of nation states and recognition and those sort of things. So yeah, I definitely think it's got legs.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk.
Thank you. I tracked it the wrong way, I didn't factor in the introduction. I tracked it, yeah, but.
My fault.
No, it's mine, because I didn't put all the elements in there.